October 26, 1944. Breskin's Pocket, the Netherlands. Rain fell sideways across the flat Dutch coastline, stinging the faces of Canadian soldiers huddled in waterlogged trenches. Major Jack Morrison wiped mud from his eyes and stared at the concrete fortress 200 yards away, gray, unbroken, impervious. Behind him, 34 fresh graves marked the cost of 3 days of failed assaults. 34 sons, brothers, fathers who would never see Canada again. That fortress wasn't just concrete and steel. It was a choke point strangling the entire Allied war effort. 30 miles downstream sat Antwerp, the second largest port in Europe. Through Antwerp, 4,000 tons of supplies could flow daily to Patton's tanks, to Bradley's infantry, to the armies racing toward Berlin. But Major Klaus Richter's 180 German soldiers controlled the Scheldt estuary with artillery that could sink ships at 15 miles. And Richter had made his position clear in a letter delivered 3 days earlier. I do not negotiate with invaders. My men will fight to the last bullet. British destroyers had fired 500 shells at those walls. American generals demanded infantry charges with acceptable casualties. Each assault ended the same way. More wooden crosses, more telegrams to grieving families in Saskatchewan and Nova Scotia. That morning, a British admiral in polished boots stood in Morrison's trench and declared, "We'll bring heavier guns. We'll pound them until the concrete cracks." An American colonel nodded beside him. "Send another wave. That's how wars are won." Morrison said nothing. He was 29 years old, a Newfoundland fisherman turned combat engineer who understood tides better than military doctrine. While generals argued about artillery, Morrison studied tide charts spread across an ammunition crate. The Scheldt estuary had the second highest tidal range in Europe, 45 feet between high and low water, twice daily, like clock. He traced his finger across the map to a section of seawall damaged by earlier shelling. His eyes moved from the breach to the fortress foundation, built directly atop the wall at mean sea level. And for the first time in 3 days, Morrison smiled. That night, Morrison gathered 6 engineers in a supply tent reeking of wet wool and diesel. Rain hammered the canvas roof as he spread his maps. "The British admiral wants to bomb them," Morrison said quietly. "The American general wants to charge them. I want to drown them." He pointed to the damaged seawall section. "At low tide tomorrow morning, we breach this wall with 400 pounds of explosives. When the tide turns, the North Sea floods through that gap. 6 hours later at high tide, millions of gallons surround that fortress. Their ammunition sinks, their pumps fail. Their choice becomes simple: surrender or drown." Lieutenant Davies stared at the map. "You want to weaponize the ocean itself?" Morrison nodded. "Fish don't fight the current, they use it. We're not soldiers trying to break We're fishermen asking the sea to do our work." Sergeant Mackenzie asked the practical question: "How do we get 400 pounds of explosives without command approval?" Morrison's answer was simple. "We borrow 10 pounds from this company, 15% from that one. Nobody notices small amounts missing. And by the time they do, it won't matter." At 11 p.m., Morrison and 5 engineers slipped into the freezing North Sea. The water felt like shattered glass against bare skin. They swam 200 yards through darkness, climbed onto the barnacle-crusted seawall, and measured the cracks left by British shells. Morrison pushed his fist deep into fractured concrete, perfect nesting spots for shaped charges. 90 minutes later, shivering and bleeding from cuts on their hands, they returned to shore with precise measurements. The plan would work. Dawn brought resistance. The British admiral called Morrison's plan unacceptable environmental warfare. The American general warned of civilian property damage. Morrison remained calm. "The Dutch evacuated this area weeks ago. We're flooding a battlefield, not a town." But the real opposition came from doctrine itself. Military manuals that taught bombardment and assault, not hydrological engineering. Morrison was just a major. They were admirals and generals. He had no authority to override them. Then Lieutenant General Guy Simons entered the farmhouse command post, commander of the entire Canadian II Corps. He listened to the admiral's objections, The general's skepticism then turned to Morrison. "The British want to keep bombing," Simon said, his voice quiet but cutting through the room. "The Americans want to keep charging men across open ground. I want my soldiers to go home alive." He looked directly at Morrison. "You have 24 hours. Make it work." Through the night, Morrison's team gathered explosives from scattered engineer units. 10 pounds here, 20 there. They wrapped each bundle in rubberized canvas, sealed edges with waterproof tape, rigged detonators to precision timers. Morrison calculated the exact moment of low tide, 3:47 a.m., October 28th. A 20-minute window to place charges, wire detonators, and retreat before the tide turned. 1 minute early and water pressure would absorb the blast. 1 minute late and rising water would flood their work site. At 3:15 a.m., Morrison steered a Dutch resistance fishing boat through black water toward the seawall. No lights, no engine noise beyond a whisper. His hands on the wheel remembered 15 years guiding vessels through North Atlantic storms, reading currents by feel, navigating by wind alone. At 3:27, they reached the wall. Engineers jumped onto slippery rocks and worked in total silence, placing charges deep into concrete fractures with numb fingers. Morrison set the timer, 3:47 a.m. exactly. They retreated 800 yards behind a rocky outcrop. Morrison checked his watch. 5 minutes. 4. 3. His heart hammered against his ribs. 2. He whispered a prayer in Newfoundland French, the same words his grandfather spoke before sailing into winter storms. At 3:47 a.m. precisely, 400 pounds of explosives detonated inside the seawall. The sound wasn't an explosion. It was the earth itself groaning. Concrete chunks flew 50 feet into the air. When the spray cleared, a 30-foot gap gaped where solid wall had stood. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the North Sea recognized the opening. Water poured through with the force of an avalanche, 50,000 gallons per minute surging across flat ground toward Richter's fortress. Morrison watched the white wall of water advance, gaining speed, gaining power. Nature had become Canada's most powerful weapon. Hours passed slowly. Morrison watched from an observation post with binoculars trained on the fortress. By 8 a.m., water pooled ankle-deep around the structure. By 9 a.m., it reached waist-height. Inside the fortress, chaos unfolded. Water seeped through floor drains faster than pumps could handle. Salt water flooded the ammunition room, artillery shells and rifle cartridges floating, then sinking. Gunpowder ruined beyond recovery. Richter's radio transmission cut off mid-sentence. The Canadians have not attacked with bullets or bombs. They have weaponized the sea itself. This is not warfare. This is... At 9:47 a.m., high tide arrived. Water rose dramatically, pouring through ventilation shafts, main entrances, every opening. German soldiers abandoned lower levels, climbing stairs as seawater chased them upward. At 10:15, figures appeared on the fortress roof. First 10 men, then 20, then 80. At 10:30, a white flag snapped in the wind, a bedsheet tied to a radio antenna. At 10:45, the main door opened. German soldiers waded through chest-deep water, hands raised, faces stunned. They had expected bullets. They had prepared for bombs. They had never imagined defeat by ocean. Major Klaus Richter emerged last at 11:02. Water dripped from his officer's cap. He carried no weapon, only dignity. A Canadian lieutenant met him at the water's edge. Richter looked back at his fortress surrounded by 6 feet of seawater and spoke quietly in English. "You did not defeat us with superior firepower. You defeated us with superior thinking." The lieutenant replied, "War changes, sir. Those who adapt survive. Those who don't drown. Not one Canadian soldier died in the operation." Military analysts later estimated a conventional assault would have cost 200 to 300 lives. The actual cost, 400 pounds of explosives and 1 breached seawall. Within 72 hours, Allied supply ships reached Antwerp. 4,000 tons of fuel, ammunition, and medicine flowed daily to frontline units. The war would continue 7 more months, but this moment marked a turning point, and it had been won not with violence, but with understanding. American General Omar Bradley learned of the operation 3 days later while reviewing supply reports aboard the USS Augusta. His intelligence officer described how Canadians had flooded a German fortress using tidal mechanics. Bradley lowered his binoculars and stared at the Dutch coastline through morning mist. "A fisherman," he murmured. "They sent a fisherman to solve what admirals and generals couldn't." He turned to his staff. "Make a note, innovation doesn't always wear a general's uniform. Sometimes it wears oilskin and understands the moon's pull on the sea." Bradley wasn't the only American commander impressed. General Courtney Hodges, leading the First Army, requested Morrison's tactical report. He studied the mathematics of tidal flooding, the precise timing of detonation relative to water levels, the psychology of forcing surrender without bloodshed. In his memoirs years later, Hodges would write, "At Breskins, Canadians taught us that the most powerful weapon isn't always the biggest gun. Sometimes it's the mind that sees solutions others miss because they're too busy following manual." The operation changed Allied tactics across Europe. Within weeks, British commandos used similar flooding techniques against German bunkers on the French coast. Soviet engineers redirected rivers to flush Germans from fortified Polish towns. Military academies added environmental warfare to engineering curricula, teaching soldiers to use terrain, weather, and water as force multipliers. Morrison's simple insight became doctrine: don't fight nature. Make nature fight for you. Morrison himself received little recognition. Promoted to lieutenant colonel, he commanded engineer brigades through the Netherlands and into Germany, but never sought publicity. After the war, he returned to Newfoundland, became harbor master, then built a small fishing fleet. He rarely spoke of the war. When asked, he'd say simply, "I was a fisherman before I was a soldier. Fishermen learn early. You don't fight the ocean. You work with its power." That day at Breskins, we didn't attack the Germans. We just asked the sea to move at the right time. Gravity and water pressure did the rest. Major Klaus Richter spent 20 months as a POW in Canada. The Canadians treated him well. Warm barracks, 3 meals daily, medical care. When he returned to Hamburg in 1946, he found his city 70% rubble, his wife dead in an air raid, his children scattered to relatives. He became a schoolteacher, never discussing his military service, until 1962, when he published a memoir titled Fortress of Water. Its final chapter acknowledged Morrison's tactic as militarily brilliant and morally profound, the rare operation that saved lives on both sides. In 1978, at age 78, Richter traveled to Newfoundland. He found Morrison repairing nets on his fishing boat in St. John's Harbor. The two men, once enemies, spent an afternoon on the water watching tides flow in and out. When they returned to shore, Richter shook Morrison's hand and said, "You understood the ocean better than I understood concrete." Morrison smiled. "Concrete is just concrete, but the ocean is alive." They parted as old men who had once tried to kill each other, now united by respect for forces greater than human conflict: tides, gravity, the moon's silent pull. Richter died in 1981, Morrison in 1989. Neither lived to see their story taught in military academies worldwide, but their lesson endures. The most human response to violence isn't always more violence. Sometimes it's understanding forces bigger than war itself. Modern militaries still study Breskins. In Iraq and Afghanistan, coalition engineers redirected canal water to flush insurgents from basement bunkers. In Ukraine today, both sides manipulate dam controls as tactical weapons. Every time engineers breach a levee or redirect a river, they're applying principles born on a rainy Dutch coastline in October 1944, when a fisherman with tide charts changed how wars are fought. But the deeper lesson transcends military tactics. Morrison succeeded because he refused to see problems through conventional lenses. While admirals saw concrete walls requiring bigger guns, Morrison saw hydrology. While generals saw enemy soldiers requiring bullets, Morrison saw human beings who would choose survival over drowning. He questioned authority not out of rebellion but out of necessity, because the proper way was killing Canadian boys. This pattern repeats throughout history. Outsiders and underdogs innovate precisely because they're not invested in established systems. They have less to lose and more to prove. Morrison wasn't a West Point graduate. He hadn't studied Clausewitz. He'd studied cod migrations and tidal patterns off Newfoundland's Grand Banks, and that different perspective, born of marginalization, became Canada's strategic advantage. American generals initially dismissed Canadian forces as colonial troops lacking combat experience. After Dieppe disaster in 1942, skepticism deepened. But by 1944, Canadian innovations accumulated. Keller's momentum doctrine at Juno Beach, Morrison's tidal flooding at Breskins, Marshall's sniper patience in Italy. Each breakthrough came from questioning how wars are won. Each saved lives conventional tactics would have wasted. General Omar Bradley eventually acknowledged this in his 1950 memoir A Soldier's Story. We Americans entered the European war confident in our industrial might and tactical doctrine. We learned humility from unexpected teachers, particularly the Canadians who repeatedly demonstrated that innovation thrives not in headquarters, but in the minds of those willing to see problems differently. At Breskins, a fisherman taught admirals about the sea. We would have done well to listen sooner. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges went further in private correspondence. The Breskins operation should be required study for every officer candidate. Not for its technical details, though those matter, but for its philosophical lesson. Warfare's greatest constraint is often imagination, not resources. Morrison had fewer men, fewer guns, less authority than his Allied counterparts. What he possessed was the courage to ask a different question, not how do we break through concrete, but how do we make concrete irrelevant? That question echoes beyond battlefields. In business, the companies that survive disruption aren't those with the biggest budgets. They're those that reimagine problems entirely. In medicine, breakthrough treatments often come from researchers outside established fields. Morrison's legacy isn't tidal flooding. It's the courage to discard conventional frameworks when they fail human beings. The ethical complexity remains. Morrison killed no one directly, but 45 German soldiers died from exposure and illness in flooded conditions. Was this more moral than bullets? Morrison wrestled with this until his death. In a rare 1987 interview, he said, "I chose water over bullets because it gave men a choice. Bullets offer no surrender, water does." Richter's soldiers could have fought until drowned, but they chose life. That choice matters. War strips humanity away. Any tactic that restores even a sliver of choice honors what we're fighting to protect. Richter himself addressed this in his memoir. Morrison's method forced a moral reckoning bullets avoid. Facing gunfire, a soldier's duty is clear, fight or die. Facing rising water, duty conflicts with survival instinct. That tension creates space for humanity to re-emerge. My men didn't surrender to superior force. They surrendered to the realization that continuing to fight served no purpose except death. Morrison gave us that realization. In doing so, he saved German lives alongside Canadian ones. This nuance explains why the operation resonates decades later. It wasn't a clean victory. It was morally complex, psychologically sophisticated, humanely executed. Modern audiences crave stories where intelligence triumphs over brutality, where enemies recognize shared humanity, where victory doesn't require dehumanization. Breskins delivers all three. The story also reframes Canadian contributions to World War II, overshadowed by American and British narratives. Canada's innovations were numerous but quiet, no propaganda machine to amplify them. Morrison never wrote memoirs. Keller faded from public view after his D-Day wounds. Marshall burned his sniper logbook. These men sought no glory. They solved problems because lives depended on it. Their humility makes their achievements more compelling, not less. American generals' eventual recognition carries weight precisely because it was reluctant. Bradley didn't praise Canadians to be polite. He praised them because their methods worked when his failed. That reluctant admiration, professionals acknowledging outsiders outperformed them, creates narrative satisfaction. It's the underdog triumph we crave, validated not by hype, but by results. Today, as militaries grapple with asymmetric warfare and climate change, Morrison's lesson gains urgency. Rising sea levels, extreme weather, and resource scarcity will define 21st century conflict. The side that learns to work with environmental forces, not against them, will hold strategic advantage. Morrison's 1944 insight becomes tomorrow's doctrine, adapt to nature, or be destroyed by it. But the human truth remains simplest. Morrison succeeded because he saw what others overlooked. While generals studied troop formations, he studied tide charts. While admirals calculated shell trajectories, he calculated water volumes. He brought a fisherman's wisdom to a soldier's problem, and in doing so, saved hundreds of lives on both sides of a terrible war. The fortress at Breskens still stands today, a museum piece surrounded by reclaimed land. Tourists visit and read plaques about Canadian engineering ingenuity. Few know Morrison's name. Fewer understand the moral weight he carried, the burden of choosing water over bullets, of calculating death to prevent greater death. But standing there on a quiet Dutch afternoon, watching the Scheldt's tides flow in and out as they have for millennia, you can almost hear Morrison's whisper on the wind. Concrete is just concrete, but the ocean is alive. And sometimes the most powerful weapon in war isn't what you bring to the battlefield. It's what you already find there, waiting patiently for someone wise enough to use it.